Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to Entelocius. My name is Paul. To gather behavioral kineses, the world has not only had its experiments. In fact, the protosphere of human inhabitation is a bona fide treatise of modification, where the crafts of distal, proximal, and mobile architectures, cosmogenic horizontalism, New World perversity, globalization and cosmopolitanism, and linearities and vascularities coalesce immaculate substance in reserve. Wherever we look, we are settled and fulfilled from without. Urban and suburban designs are reaped, retracted, engrossed, and conceptualized unto geographies like hunger's cut both ways. And the slouch of domestic fortune exudes presence from which we cannot turn away, for it is culprit as much our engrossment. I believe the argument from population is an understatement. The village is as much the town which is, in turn, the city, for we subtract our any places from ourselves, leaving only the barest assurances of that with which we compromise. You might think our lasting bones mourn presence, but the landscape is steadfast reproductive inculcation. We should count on our places like they are accounted memories, which moving through we go into space. The motor becomes less and less active, that is, more resolute, as space becomes visible, spared from undue prominence or that which obscures repulsion and finitude. And from this lofty identity only two practices exist, complacence and excision. You might say this sounds regal or theological, and I would agree with you to the extent that nothing makes this exercise possible, and to the extent our identities do not surface and abound casually, proving alternative means. If complacence does not require explanation, conversely, the reason for excision is that the ecological hive or naturality converges prototypes and dissimulates its domestic psychologies by laying them down flat, and the floor or canvas does not reveal its size. Thus, they clutter, much as a table might. I believe the common responsibility of urban and suburban design is psychological, and in this regard primarily to do with symbolic countenance, with purveyance of a ceaseless surface area. No wonder the phylogenetic principle then predisposing maximal surface area and gyrification rather than increased thickness to facilitate connectivity and functional development. Yet paradoxically, urbania and suburbia are at best internally incomprehensible and incommensurate, irreconcilably disparate, proving to an interminable extent less than satisfying, as if, to embody a Lacanian supposition, neither the objectification of environment could support a perfectly mirrored predication of the internal milieu. If language processing probably requires both the very specialized regions and more domain-general regions, thus proving richly amenable to environmental gradation and normalization, for the most part the environment pertains to cytoplasm, to neurofilamentous. The landscape appears stuck at eternal ends to a representation of the telomery of neural system activation, which is to mean embodiment of a suborn eclecticism. Its complexity is tacit, but not undone. It is designed for change, for maintenance of the original trace of the feedback loop, and roughly this is the myopic representation we take for a brain, when in reality it is the best case depiction of rich spatial structures consummate with, in elusive or metaphoric terms, logarithmic embodiments of the temporal lobe, and in other terms structural abundance, absolute localization. To return to a latter point, design portfolios exist not to a mere signification, but to subvert and make living, these being interchangeable phenomena, the impossibility of psychological mechanism, its sheaths, its nodes, its drives. And it is misleading to discuss places like they are rational communities of interest, for this presupposes the implicit reciprocity of interest, of desire, which is a largely synthetic or production-based courtesy as opposed to a discharge logic. Instead, the significant definitions of design convolve transverse planes, very much like axes undergirding functional etymologies, wherefrom they coordinate and essentialize emergent human behaviors, starting firstly from a basic protest, no wonder the motif, between automata and desiderata. Within any landscape, a stipulation exists between handiwork named robotic or procedural and, conversely, peripheral affectations. This perspective is also the tallest possible extension of height wherefrom clinical or behaviorist scrutiny stands to signify. The bulky responsibilities of the farmer, who is punctual, slovenly, and unimpeded, are countervailed by the disorganized responsibilities of the urbanite, who is endlessly outdone. Strangely, the mutual and most familiar draw for urban and suburban stretches is temporal collapse. In these places, time is layered into every civil chore and self-organized ceiling and has its continuum rehearsed from every device of decision-making and labor. there are involutions through which the future composes soma, or the organs of the body. Namely, we do not need to look ahead, for the soma is patently clear, although the future is always the first place to look since it is coordinated with the Entelocius, which in the context of time, as opposed to ontology, much more closely approaches universal drive intentionality that generally motivates the potential openness of the streaming life of subjectivity. Then there are absentias, during which the Husserlian past horizon retains and composes missing pieces. These are present like ad hoc corrections amending lengths from self to future. And there are irresponses, during which the present tense composes mistakes. These are waking experiences. Hence, from this comprehension of landscape incompletion and taciturn, that is, dormant temporality, it is quite easy to see that design drives profound evolutionary challenge, albeit at persistent or given and self-limited scales. Challenge, however, is not the same as resistance. Challenge forces response, or wisdom, whereas resistance contemplates the locus without actionary pause. The landscape plotline is a familiar first glance, and within the diet of vivacity, suburbia is like an organizational staple. However, unlike urban curvature, which proves a miserly quotient in the edificial mire, suburban curves in the road refuse or fail to transect the sky, and instead these are gathered ordinally and contribute to measures of value, albeit not in and of themselves, but in substance. Highways or thoroughfares make explicit where they lead, and thus, since neither directions nor indications are figurative outcomes, a loophole which is part and parcel of the Entelocius, we often drive to obtain indiscriminately, that is, estimates of gas, trays of convenience food, etc. Meanwhile, the cars parked at the heads of their driveways both close off and expand their properties and contribute to porous sophistication, and exuded as opposed to outright industrialization, and the essence itself of a garage door suggests a hub is thriving behind closed doors. Newly developed plazas are primordialized and subsequently completed with knowable recognitions, such as a coffee chain branch or grocery branch, but in this context they are rounded and enriched, that is, brands of names or like token fulfillments, rather than names of brands. Next, within the plaza, an animal hospital is outspoken. The gym is tightly squeezed or predominant. A podiatrist and an optical boutique in close proximity provide mutual stabilization in that between them implicit sight is physically centralized. And a sandwich shop near an Asian restaurant familiarizes alienation or adopts it for its own, where Asian can easily signify estranged, peculiar, and indicative, what which festoon the culinary, whereas a sandwich is disproportionately traditional however and howsoever it is sold. Let us say you are walking and on one side of a path you see an item of trash, and on the other side you see a tree that is taller than its surrounding kin. This contrast would ostensibly prime competitive self-configurations, in that trash is a stagnant, depleted, debased, and obviously discarded iota that has been implicitly categorized to permanently aver repudiation and disgust, and, from the sense knowing surely its ultimate direction, devolution, especially if the iota is something junky like a bag of chips. Whereas a tall tree suggests virility and upgrowth, upward, and arguably phallic, momentum, and thus contends aspiration and grandeur. Hence you might say the path, at least at that specific location, obtains for itself from opposite contentions comparative neutrality, yet tangibilizes this achievement to a greater relative extent than expected. Likewise, if we are driving and see a tree broken from wind or from an accident and held together by flimsy cast, we are primed to drive more safely. Alternatively, a tree which is profligate with those banana-like seed pods situated at a bus stop primes distance and vigor, respectively jungle and travel, or the threat of winter, for example icicles. And not to mention, pigeons and squirrels are visual floaters just as much as reticulated familiars, and perhaps for the same reason, though we do not quite know just how their interruptions become compounded and reified from conscious perception. Perhaps organic pockmarks push aside our lengthy, platitudinous templates in favor of trivial disorder or abandon. As you have surely figured, urban and suburban landscapes are much more than conflicted and mashable tropes. The former is where steam is gathered and, independent of its contusions, where discoveries are, paradoxically, modified. Because these latter are physical and systemic, they both coarsely refine and emancipate syndromal expressions, yet to their credit they also systematize in order to appraise and validate both medical and quintessential dignities, a facet which requires physical syncopation and scanted physical practicalities. The inherent propensity of the city to validate dignity is a draw to the prophetic voice, who lives to mire it without escape. Comparatively, the congenital loafing for which suburban sprawl is notorious and protected is readily attributable to its lowliness of physical overture. The suburban development is easily remedied or rearranged and cheapened, leaving it, in my view, almost entirely without drive, and not so differently, the urban development is vacuous and self-fulfilling. This is why the act of knocking down walls, something so rudimentary and barbaric, is confused for baptistic. If baptisms take place in private or in a form of public privacy, the urban baptism instead tends to be on par with the ingrained public body in order to be validated, conformed, and naturalized. That is to say, the urban sense is overt precisely to make itself sensibilized, leaving factors like urban legibility and proximities of incompatible uses largely frivolous, unimportant, and redundant. Obviously, as I have made clear, these landscapes are compartmentalized rather than governed, and coupled with the destructive aspect of growth's synthetic observational systems like the Economist Intelligence Unit and their Global Livability Index, metricize what should instead be systematized and fail invariably to notice failure, and for this reason change endlessly but lose ultimately to growth. The irony especially of urban development is its lack of anthropocentric taste, being completely at ends, yet its insatiable indulgence of anxiety, which is the anthropogenic foreclosure of escape. Low building canopies attest to tasks, and they reduce expectations, and in this way they conform and predispose anxiety. But low event horizons are like false proximities, like the provocations of a lofty, and thus inaccessible, reassurance. And heterogeneous derision from block and tall buildings causes abrupt, unsettled, and arguably self-compelling or anxious trajectory independent of its map. And if the urban walk is a method of hygiene or purification, the locale is not only disproportionately, but quite apparently unhygienic, contributing specifically to the authority of self-determination, as opposed to its actuality. Thus, the structural superego, if it exists, clearly does not emanate from its materialism, and on this fact, researchers who have studied the relationship between schizophrenia spectrum disorders and the living environment have not been entirely clear with their operationalizations of deprivation, suggesting the inadequacy of materialism to explanations of our effects as much the conflagration of depth psychology in terms of living immanence. The contingencies of urban development present an onus for emphasis from selection rather than involution or indulgence, and hence seem neither to refine nor to support the self-similarity and irregularity of the human or subjective dendriform. However, and perhaps owing to its objectivity, landscape schiz or schizoanalysis is unsustainable, as discontinuous and precipitous as its declensions of cause and artifice, which not only vindicates its schizophrenic or schizophrenized distress, proving among other things how irrational perception can be, but recapitulates and vitalizes subjectivization in its less behavioral and thus more flexible ostentation. That brings me to the end of episode 8. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please click like and subscribe. I encourage opinions, discussion, and suggestions in the comments below. Episode 9 is about indigeneity. So, mind your path, raise your vision, reach your arms, and steal your sight. Rhizomatic transcendence is around the corner. See you again.